When my husband of 31 years sat down across from me at our kitchen table and told me he was in love with someone else, the first thing I noticed was that he was wearing a new shirt. Pale blue linen, freshly pressed. He'd bought it for her, I realized. He'd worn it for her first, then come home to destroy our marriage in it. Her name was Cassidy. She was 32 years old. She taught spin classes at the gym where Richard had been going every Saturday morning for the past year and a half. Every Saturday morning while I made coffee and read the paper, and assumed my husband of 3 decades was simply trying to stay healthy. I was 59 years old, and I had never felt more foolish in my entire life. But I didn't cry. Not in front of him. I sat very still, and I listened, and I let him say every word he needed to say. He talked about feeling disconnected. He talked about getting older and wanting to feel alive again. He talked about Cassidy like she was oxygen, and our marriage had been slowly suffocating him. He actually used that word. Suffocating. I poured myself more coffee while he talked. I nodded in the right places, and somewhere around the 15-minute mark, when he paused to gauge my reaction, I looked at him calmly and said, "Richard, where exactly do you plan to live?" He blinked. He hadn't expected that question. He'd expected tears, or screaming, or begging. He'd prepared for a storm. He didn't know how to handle a clear, quiet morning. He told me he wanted the beach house, and I smiled. The beach house had been mine long before it was ours. My parents bought it in 1987, a small cedar shingled place in North Carolina, right on the Outer Banks. 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a view of the water that made every problem feel smaller. When my father passed in 2009, he left it to me and my sister Carol equally. When Carol moved to Arizona and decided she never wanted to see another ocean again, she sold me her half for far below market value because she loved me and wanted me to have it. Richard contributed nothing to that house. Not the purchase, not the repairs, not the 23 years of maintenance and property taxes and hurricane shutters. But in North Carolina, after 31 years of marriage, things get complicated. Property that enters a marriage can sometimes become marital property, depending on how it's been used, titled, and treated. Richard knew this. More importantly, Richard's divorce attorney knew this. What they didn't know was what I had already done. 3 months before Richard sat down in that pale blue linen shirt, I had sold the beach house. I had sold it for $2,300,000. The market on the Outer Banks had gone absolutely insane in the past few years, and that small cedar shingled place my father had bought for $87,000 in 1987 had turned into something extraordinary. I had sold it quietly, without fanfare, using an attorney in a different county, and I had moved every single dollar of the proceeds into a structure that Richard's name was nowhere near. I handed him the keys with a smile, because the keys opened nothing that belonged to him. The new owners had already been living there for 11 weeks. As far as Richard was concerned, he had just secured his prize. As far as reality was concerned, he had just accepted a set of metal objects that unlocked a door in a house he would never legally touch. I want you to understand something before I keep going. I am not a vengeful person by nature. I was a high school English teacher for 26 years. I coached the literary magazine. I brought casseroles to sick neighbors and remembered every student's birthday. Revenge has never been a word I associated with myself. But there is a difference between revenge and protection, and everything I did because I saw what was coming and I refused to be left with nothing. Let me tell you how I knew. It started 14 months before the blue linen shirt. I came home from school on a Thursday afternoon in February, and Richard's laptop was open on the counter. He'd left in a hurry for some work meeting and hadn't closed it. I wasn't snooping. I was moving it to plug in my phone charger. But the screen was on, and what was on the screen was a message thread. I didn't read far. I didn't need to. 3 lines told me everything. I closed the laptop. I stood in my kitchen for probably 4 minutes without moving. Then I did something that surprised even me. I didn't confront him. I didn't send an angry text. I called my college roommate, Diane, who had become a family law attorney in Raleigh, and I said, "Diane, I need to have a very quiet conversation with you." Diane is one of those women who never wastes words. She listened to me for about 90 seconds and then said, "Don't touch anything, don't move anything, don't close any accounts, and don't say a single word to him. Come see me Saturday." I went to see her Saturday. Richard thought I was visiting my friend Paula. I sat in Diane's home office for 3 hours, and by the time I left, I had a plan. Not a revenge plan, a protection plan. There is a difference, and I need you to understand that difference because it shaped every decision I made in the months that followed. Diane walked me through what a divorce from Richard would look like under North Carolina law. We'd been married 30 years at that point. Richard made more than I did. He was a regional sales director for a medical equipment company. Good salary, annual bonuses, stock options. I had a teacher's pension and Social Security coming, but nothing dramatic. We had a joint investment account, a joint savings account, the house we lived in, and the beach house. We had Richard's 401k and a smaller IRA in my name. The beach house was the complicated piece. Because we had used it jointly for 31 years. Because we had made improvements together, filed joint insurance claims, taken family vacations there. Richard's attorney, if he ever got one, would argue it had become marital property. He might not win that argument, but he might also not lose it completely. He might get a piece of it. And the idea of Cassidy and her spin classes sitting on my father's porch, watching my ocean, made me feel something I don't have a word for. So Diane made some calls, and I made some decisions. I listed the beach house in March. I used a realtor named Beverly, who was a friend of Diane's and who understood the assignment, which was to be efficient, discreet, and fast. The market did the rest. We had 4 offers within 9 days. We accepted the best one, cash buyer, closing in 30 days. The whole thing was completed in April. $2,350,000, minus closing costs, minus Beverly's commission, minus attorney fees, came to just over $2,100,000. Every dollar went into a vehicle that Diane helped me structure. I am not going to give you every legal detail because this is my story and not a legal textbook, but I will tell you that it was done properly. It was done legally, and it was done in a way that Richard's attorney spent considerable time later trying to undo and ultimately could not. That money became mine in a way that was airtight. Then I waited. I want to tell you what those 14 months were like, living in the same house as a man you know is betraying you, watching him lie to your face every single day. He was good at it. That's the part that still gets me sometimes, late at night when I let myself think about it. He was so good at it. Saturday mornings at the gym, late evenings on the phone in the garage. Business trips that I now know weren't business trips. He looked at me over dinner and asked about my day. He remembered to buy the brand of sparkling water I liked. He was performing marriage like a role he'd memorized while his real life was happening somewhere else entirely. I performed too. I made dinner. I asked about his week. I sat next to him at my niece's graduation and laughed at his jokes and let him hold my hand during the ceremony. I was performing patience. I was performing unknowing. I was very, very good at it. Diane had advised me to wait until I had everything properly in order before any confrontation happened. The beach house sale needed to be complete and settled. The financial restructuring needed to be finalized. The documentation I had quietly been gathering with Diane's guidance needed to be thorough, and my own emotional state needed to be stable. Because she told me, and she was right, that the calmer I was, the stronger my position would be when things finally broke open. I am not going to pretend those 14 months didn't cost me something. They did. There were nights I cried in the shower where he couldn't hear. There were mornings I sat in my car in the school parking lot for 10 minutes before I could make myself go inside and teach. There were moments I looked at Richard across the breakfast table and felt a grief so large I couldn't find the edges of it. But there were also moments I felt something else, a steadiness, a clarity, a sense of myself as a person who was not going to be discarded and left with nothing. Not after 31 years, not after giving this man the best decades of my life. I held on to that steadiness like a railing in the dark. Richard told me about Cassidy in June. Second week of June, a Wednesday evening, the kitchen table, the blue linen shirt. The conversation lasted about 40 minutes. He told me he wanted a divorce. He said he wanted it to be civil. He said he hoped we could divide things fairly and part as friends. He brought up the beach house about 20 minutes in, which told me he'd been thinking about it carefully, maybe planning it, probably discussing it with Cassidy. He said it made sense for him to have the beach house because he loved the water and because maybe he and Cassidy could use it as a fresh start. I handed him the keys from the hook by the door. He looked confused. He said, "What are these?" I said, "The keys to the beach house. You said you wanted it." He stared at them. He said, "Just like that?" I said, "Just like that." He didn't know what to do with that. He'd been prepared to negotiate. He'd been prepared to fight. He had not been prepared for easy. He took the keys and looked at them for a long moment, and I watched something cross his face that I can only describe as relief mixed with guilt, and I said nothing else about it. He moved out that weekend into an apartment near Cassidy's gym. He took his clothes, his golf clubs, his record collection, and his laptop. He left behind 31 years of furniture, dishes, artwork, holiday decorations, and every photograph of our marriage. I let him take what he wanted. I was thinking further ahead. His attorney contacted Diane 3 weeks later. A man named Jeffrey with a G, which told me something already. Jeffrey sent a very confident letter outlining Richard's position and his expectations for the divorce settlement. The letter referenced the beach house by name. It referenced the improvements made during the marriage. It used phrases like marital asset and equitable distribution and shared investment. It was a thorough letter. Jeffrey with a G had done his homework. Diane sent a response that I wish I could have seen Jeffrey's face reading. The beach house, Diane explained, had been sold 3 months prior at fair market value in a properly executed transaction with a cash buyer, and the proceeds had been managed accordingly. Jeffrey was welcome to verify the public record of the sale, which he would find in the county deed filings. The property no longer existed as a marital asset because the property no longer existed in my possession. I know what happened next because Richard called me, and it was the only time in that entire divorce process that he raised his voice at me. He said, "You sold the beach house." I said, "I did." He said, "When?" I said, "April." There was a silence. Then he said, "That was our house." And I said, very quietly, "No, Richard, that was my house. My father bought it. My family built it. Your name was never on the deed. I held that house in my name alone for the entirety of our marriage, and I had every legal right to sell it." He said, "You planned this." I said, "I protected myself. There's a difference." He hung up. I made tea. What followed was 6 months of divorce proceedings that I will not pretend were easy. Jeffrey with a G was persistent and expensive, which meant Richard was spending real money fighting battles he wasn't going to win. They contested the beach house sale. They got a forensic accountant to look at my finances. They subpoenaed bank records. They did everything they could to find a handle to grab onto. They didn't find one. Diane is worth every dollar I have ever paid her. The marital home, the house we lived in, was divided as part of the settlement. Richard got half the equity, which was fair, and I kept the house by refinancing and paying him out. I didn't want to leave my home. I'd lived there for 22 years. My garden was there, my neighbors were there, my life was there. Richard's 401k was divided as part of the settlement. He got his half of our joint accounts. He got a fair and appropriate portion of what was genuinely shared between us. What he did not get was $2,100,000 that was mine before he ever walked into that kitchen in a blue linen shirt. Jeffrey with a G tried one more angle about 4 months in. He argued that I had deliberately concealed assets and manipulated the settlement by selling the property prior to filing. Diane took apart that argument with a calm thoroughness that I found genuinely beautiful to witness. The property had been listed publicly. The sale had been recorded publicly. Richard had been a non-titled, non-purchasing party to that property throughout the marriage and had no legal claim that superseded my ownership rights. I had sold my property. I had not hidden the proceeds. I had structured them legally. There was no concealment. There was no fraud. There was a woman who had seen something coming and had not waited to be run over. The divorce was finalized in January. Now let me tell you what I did with the money. Because that is, after all, what the title of this story promises, and I keep my promises. I didn't buy a yacht. I didn't move to Paris. I didn't do anything dramatic or cinematic. What I did was far more satisfying than any of that, and I'll explain why. First, I paid off the remaining mortgage on my house outright. Gone my home, free and clear, mine forever. There is a piece to that I cannot fully describe. Every morning I wake up in a house that no one can take from me, and I feel it in a way I didn't even know I was missing. Second, I set up a scholarship fund at the school where I taught. I retired last May after 26 years in the classroom, and I wanted to leave something behind. The fund is named after my father. It sends one student to college every year, specifically a student who is the first in their family to go, specifically a student who loves to read. It is called the Robert Henson First Generation Scholarship, and it has already sent 2 kids to university. I attended both send-off ceremonies. I cried at both of them, the good kind. Third, I bought a small piece of property in the Blue Ridge Mountains, not a beach house, nothing that reminded me of what I'd had and lost. Something different, something mine, something that belonged to the next chapter of my life rather than the one that had just ended. It's a cabin, really 3 rooms, a wood stove, a creek behind it that makes a sound in the mornings that I can only describe as the opposite of grief. I go there when I need to remember who I am outside of the story that almost swallowed me. And fourth, and this is the part that I think about the most, the part that feels the most important. I gave a significant amount to my sister Carol. Not because she needed it, though she could certainly use it, because she had sold me her half of that beach house for less than it was worth because she loved me, and she deserved to share in what that love had grown into. I called her on a Tuesday morning and told her to check her account. She called me back crying. I cried too. We cried together on the phone for probably 10 minutes, which is a very Carol and Ellen thing to do. The rest I invested quietly in boring, sensible instruments that Diane's financial planner husband helped me choose. I am 60 years old. I am not trying to get rich. I am trying to be secure. I am trying to know that the rest of my life is mine to live on my own terms. Now I want to tell you about Richard, because some of you are wondering, and because the story is not quite complete without it. Richard and Cassidy moved into a 2-bedroom apartment near the gym. From what I understand through mutual friends, and I have been careful not to seek this information out, it simply finds me the way information does in small communities. Things have not gone entirely as Richard imagined. Cassidy is 32. She is young and alive and full of energy and possibility. She is also 32 years old in a relationship with a 58-year-old man who believed that love was something you could simply trade up for, like a car model or a phone plan. She is at a different stage of life than he is. She wants things that he is perhaps not as interested in providing. I hold no ill will toward her. She is not my enemy. She was, in some ways, simply the catalyst that forced a reality into the open that I might have otherwise spent another decade quietly ignoring. Richard calls me sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. The first time he called was about 4 months after the divorce was final, on a Sunday evening. And he said my name when I picked up in a voice that sounded much older than the voice I remembered. He said he wanted to talk. I said I wasn't sure what there was to say. He said he thought he'd made a mistake. I thought about that for a moment. And then I said something that surprised even me, which is that I didn't think he'd made a mistake. I thought he'd told the truth about who he was, and that the truth had simply arrived later than it should have. I wasn't angry. I wasn't cold. I told him I genuinely hoped he found peace, and I meant it. Then I said goodbye and made dinner for myself and ate it on my own porch in the evening quiet and felt something that took me a while to name. The thing I felt was freedom. I want to be careful here because I know how this story sounds from the outside. It can sound like a triumph, like a clean win, like karma delivering exactly what was owed on a silver tray. And there are parts of it that feel like that. I won't pretend otherwise. But there is another layer that doesn't make for as satisfying a story, and I think I owe you honesty about it. I grieved Richard. Not the man who wore the blue linen shirt, that man I barely recognized, but the man I had married at 28, the man who had driven me to the emergency room when I broke my wrist, the man who had sat with me through my father's last days, the man who had made me laugh so hard on a Tuesday night in 1997 that I fell off the couch and we both laughed until we couldn't breathe. I grieved that man. I grieved the life we had built, even knowing it had been partly illusion. I grieved the future I had assumed was mine, grandchildren, growing old together, someone who knew my whole history. That grief is real. It doesn't go away because the legal proceedings went well. It doesn't evaporate because the money is safe. It sits in you and you learn to carry it, and it gets lighter with time, but it doesn't disappear. What I will tell you is that the grief is survivable. That is the thing I most want to say to anyone who is in the middle of what I was in the middle of. It is survivable. The other side of it is real. The life that waits for you past the loss is real, and it can be genuinely good, and you can build it on your own terms in a way that you perhaps never could when someone else's needs were always the center of gravity. I am not glad my marriage ended, but I am glad I am who I am now. There is one more thing I want to tell you, and it is the most practical thing in this whole story. And I say it because I wished someone had said it to me. If you are in a long marriage and something feels wrong, not just a bad year, not just a rough patch, but something structural, something that sits in your stomach like a stone, please talk to someone who can help you understand your situation clearly before anything explodes. Not to plan a betrayal, not to get ahead of your spouse in some adversarial way, but to know where you stand, to understand what is yours, to be informed. I had 31 years of marriage and I knew almost nothing about our actual financial situation until I sat in Diane's home office that Saturday. I had let Richard handle the investments, the accounts, the tax filings, because he was good at it and I trusted him. And that trust was not wrong on its face, but the dependency it created left me in a very vulnerable position when the trust turned out to have limits I hadn't known about. Know your financial situation. Know what is in your accounts, what the accounts are worth, what the debts are, what the assets are. Know whose name is on what. Not because you expect the worst, but because you deserve to move through your own life with your eyes open. I didn't know enough for too long. I knew enough just in time. That is a very small margin, and I was lucky to have a friend like Diane to help me navigate it. The cabin in the Blue Ridge is at its best in October. The leaves do something there that I have not seen anywhere else. They don't just turn, they seem to burn, like the whole mountain is lit from inside. I went up there last fall for 2 weeks by myself with a stack of novels and a pair of good hiking boots and more food than any one person reasonably needs. I sat on the porch of that cabin one evening, watching the sun go down behind the ridge, and I thought about my father, and I thought about the beach house, and I thought about all the years I spent worrying about what other people needed from me, and how little time I had spent figuring out what I needed from myself. I thought about Diane. who answered the phone on a Thursday in February and told me to come see her Saturday without asking a single unnecessary question. I thought about Beverly, the realtor, who moved fast and stayed quiet, and who sent me a card after the closing that said simply, "Go build something good." I thought about Carol, crying on the phone on a Tuesday morning. I thought about my students, and about Robert Henson first-generation scholarship recipients, and about 2 kids in college right now because my father bought a cedar-shingled beach house in 1987 and loved me enough to leave it to me. And I thought about the woman who had sat at a kitchen table across from a man in a pale blue linen shirt and not cried, and who had handed over a set of keys with a steady hand, and who had known something that man did not know. I thought about her, and I felt, for the first time in as long as I could remember, genuinely proud. Here is what I know now that I didn't know 2 years ago. Security is not the same as comfort. Comfort can be taken from you. Real security, the kind you build on your own terms with your eyes open, lives in you. It is made of knowledge and clarity and the willingness to protect yourself even when protecting yourself feels hard and frightening and lonely. Love is real. What I felt for Richard for 31 years was real. But love does not obligate you to stand still while someone dismantles your life. You can have loved fully and completely and still say, when the time comes, that you will not be left with nothing. And the life that comes after the worst thing you can imagine it is not a consolation prize. It is not the runner-up version of the life you wanted. It can be something you chose, something you built, something that belongs entirely to you in a way that nothing before it ever quite did. I wake up in a paid-off house. I have a cabin where the leaves burn in October. I have a scholarship in my father's name sending children to college. I have a sister who cried on the phone because I remembered what her love was worth. And I have, at 60 years old, the extraordinary and unexpected feeling of knowing exactly who I am and what I am made of. Richard drove away with a set of keys to a house he would never enter. I drove forward into a life I am still, every day, building. That is what I did with the money.